Hi, everybody. My name is Carl Darden, and I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for joining us today here on Navy Sports Central. I'm your host, and this is the official podcast of the Navy Sports Nation, where we take a deeper dive into Navy sports. This episode represents a little bit of a milestone for the podcast, and I'll explain that more in a minute. And we will be joined by a special guest who will share some of his perspective on a program that Navy is pretty familiar with on the football field, and they share a connection in basketball as well. So please, stay with us. Okay, here we go with episode 28 of the Navy Sports Central podcast, and I mention that specifically because today's release date is March 25th, which marks the first anniversary of my very first full episode that I put out last year. So I thank everybody who's been with me from the beginning, but no matter how much you listen to the show, whether it's just occasionally or if you happen to be a first-time listener, thanks for making us part of your day. I wanted to lead off the sports update by getting into a few more details around the men's lacrosse team's historic win over Johns Hopkins last weekend. Most of you probably heard about it, but unless you follow lacrosse closely, you may not have known that Navy had gone quite a long time without ever having beaten the Blue Jays. Back in 2010, the Mids ended a 36-game losing streak to Hopkins by knocking them off at home, 9-8 in Annapolis, and since then they have won a few more times, but it's always been at Navy Marine Corps Stadium. You'd have to go all the way back to May 10th, 1969 for their last win on the Blue Jays' home field. All that ended exactly a week ago today. Led by Pat Skalniak and Max Hewitt, the Mids came from behind to beat Johns Hopkins 11-10, and that ended a losing streak that has stretched over 53 years. Now, just to clarify, this was the first game between the two teams since 2017 due to scheduling issues and the pandemic. And by the way, the Blue Jays were ranked 18th at the time. So this win was not only historic, but it's also a signal that the Mids can compete with the country's best programs. The year after Joe Amplo came to Annapolis, he brought the #1 recruiting class, according to Inside Lacrosse magazine, to the Naval Academy, and Max Hewitt was a part of that class. Last Friday, he put on a show in the fourth quarter and scored the Mids' final 3 goals to clinch the win. The men have a 5-3 record right now, and so far they are 1-1 in league play. And as of today, they only have 6 games left in the regular season, so not a lot of margin for error there. And of course, the main goal is to get to the point where you're playing at a high level once the Patriot League tournament starts, get into that title game, winning it, and punching their ticket to the NCAA tournament. The women's lacrosse team is also playing very well. They are 7-2 so far this year and 1-0 in league play. And they've outscored their opponents 123-76 through 9 games, which tells you that the offense is clicking pretty well. That goals per game average of nearly 14 is tracking slightly higher than last year. Now, a couple of months ago, I was a guest on another sports podcast, and the host asked me what I thought was a really thought-provoking question. He asked me to name the sport that represented Navy's best chance of winning a Division I championship. Of course, I did mention the 3 that the Mids won last year in rowing as well as in intercollegiate and offshore sailing. But then I said, if you're asking me about the sports that are more on people's radars, then I'm going to go with men's and women's lacrosse. And here's my reasoning. You guys bear with me on this and see if you agree. First of all, just like basketball, it's a single elimination tournament to determine the national championship. And even better, in this case, it's only a 16-team field instead of 64. And by the way, I'm not counting those 2 gimmick games in the NCAA basketball tournament that they refer to as the first 4. That's just a straight up money thing. So anyway, when you look at the lacrosse championship compared to March Madness, the national champion in lacrosse, the eventual national champion, only has to win 4 games as opposed to the 6 wins that they have to pull off in the NCAA basketball tournament. And if you just look back 8 years to the 2014 tournament, the UConn men's basketball team won it all as a number 7 seed. So that basically means that according to the selection committee, there are at least 24 other teams that they thought had a better chance of winning. And that's only if UConn was actually the best of the 4 teams that were seeded 7th across the 4 regions. But the Huskies got hot at the right time, and Kemba Walker ended up carrying them all the way to their 4th national title. So that's the first part of the formula when it comes to Navy possibly winning a national title in lacrosse. They need to be hitting their peak and playing their best lacrosse right as the tournament starts. Now, the second reason I think both the men and the women are 2 teams that are capable of winning it all is to a certain degree, the precedent has already been set for them going deep into the tournament. In 2004, the men's team got all the way to the championship game before finally falling to Syracuse in a game that went right down to the wire. And then in 2017, the women had a terrific run to the Final Four after beating Loyola to get to the tournament, and then they knocked off number 2 ranked North Carolina before going down, I believe, to Boston College. So, to be fair, 2004 was a while back, but that was a really, really good Navy team. They had a solid defense, an excellent goalkeeper, and I remember in the semifinals that year, they beat Princeton, and it was a really low-scoring game. I think it was like 7-6 or something like that. And remember, Princeton back then, I mean, they'd won 3 national championships in the 90s. So there's your precedent on the men's side. Now, as far as the women's team goes, 2017 was only 5 years ago. And my thinking is the Mids have really done a good job leveraging that result, that Final Four result, into attracting more top-tier talent to Annapolis. Coach Cindy Timchall has won several national championships at Maryland, so she knows just what it takes to get her teams ready once the tournament begins. Okay, so that's it. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and certainly it may take a couple of stars lining up just the right way. First they have to make it to the tournament. I get that. But from there, everything gets reset, and all it takes is 4 games to win it all. So I have made my case. I'm very curious to hear what you guys think, so feel free to share your thoughts on the group Facebook page. All right, I'm going to finish up this update by recognizing 2 athletes who've earned All-America status in the last week or so. The first is Jennifer Coleman from the women's basketball team. She was named as an honorable mention All-American by the Associated Press. Coleman is the first member of the Navy women's basketball program ever to earn that All-America status, and she's just the 3rd player in the Patriot League to get that distinction. So congratulations to Jennifer as she closes out a terrific basketball career at Navy. Meanwhile, Mike Zanti, who is the captain of the Navy rifle team, was selected as the Collegiate Rifle Coaches Association All-American. He was recognized as a first-team All-American in the small bore and air rifle disciplines, while also being named second-team All-American in the aggregate category. Zanti is the first mid since 2010 to earn that first-team All-American status, and he was just incredibly consistent throughout the entire year, so it's great to see him being recognized for his efforts. Okay, that does it for our sports update, but we are just getting started. Next up is our deep dive segment. All right, it is time for our deep dive segment. And you heard me say earlier that I was a guest on another sports podcast a couple of months ago. And one of the things we do to help each other out to get some exposure is what we call guest swaps. That's where we'll do a spot on each other's show so that the respective audiences can learn more about us. So my guest this week produces a show called The Original Sports Podcast, and he comes to us out of Frederick, Maryland, where he teaches full-time. I invited him on because I thought it would be fun to explore a couple of connections between Navy and one of the teams he follows. So I am happy to welcome to the show fellow sports podcaster Mark Meriday to Navy Sports Central. Hey, Mark, thanks so much for making the time to be with us today. We really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Carl, it is an honor and a pleasure to join you today. I appreciate you coming on my show just a little while back, and I love returning the favor.
Yeah, that was really a lot of fun. Now, just to kind of get the listeners, acquainted with you, tell us a little bit about how you got started producing your podcast, how long you've been doing it, and what led you down that path.
Well, I am a high school teacher by trade. I make $0 doing podcasting. And basically, we got sent home to teach from home back in March of 2020. Exact date was March 13th, 2020. Mm-hmm. And, we were at home and we were teaching from home, trying to set the world back on fire by teaching virtually. And as I was doing that, and we were all relegated to be at home, trying to figure out COVID. I wanted to get into communications as a young person. Mm-hmm. And when I tried to get into it when I was in college, they closed the field. It was so busy back then. I went to college at Indiana University of Pennsylvania mm-hmm. for my first undergrad. And I've always had that passion still. And at work, I would talk sports all the time with guys. And they would be like, man, you just know your stuff. I love listening to you talk, no matter what it is. Mm-hmm. So I'm at home, and my wife's like, you're going to have to find something to do besides teach and just do nothing. She said, why don't you get into trying to do that podcast that you've talked about? I had bought a microphone. I had done all this research. So I had a neighbor up the street, and I said, hey, Chris, can you come down and hang out with me and let's have a conversation about how you do your podcasting. This guy had a really successful podcasting about food, and he has done fantastic with it. So he comes down, masks and all. We sit outside, 12 feet apart, and we had a long conversation. And I just dove right in. My first podcast was doing it, by myself. I'd done a lot of research. It was getting close to, they had confirmed that they were still going to have the NFL draft, and I was looking at the free agency stuff. So I just did free agency stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right. Good stuff. Now, you are originally from Pittsburgh, and you shared with me earlier that you cover pretty much all the teams out there, but which one do you like to cover the most?
To be honest with you, I cover as much as possible, not just the Pittsburgh teams. I am a diehard Steelers, Penguins, and I even cover my mouth a little bit and say it, but I'm a diehard Pirates fan as far as professional teams go. I'm a huge Pitt fan. Grew up a big Pitt fan just because of my age, and during the heyday of the mid 70s going into the early 80s, Pitt was, they were on fire with guys like Tony Dorsett and Dan Marino.
Mm-hmm.
There was a guy that I actually got to watch play by the name of Bill Fralick. He played
I know that dude.
High school.
Yeah, I remember him.
He played at Penn Hills High School. He played football and he wrestled. And I actually got to meet him. I was a sophomore or freshman, and he was a senior, but he was the nicest guy. And, guys like that are what engaged me in supporting and rooting for them.
Mm-hmm.
But if I had to pick one particular sport out of all of them, it's probably evolved from football to hockey.
Oh, okay.
Probably the Steelers to the Penguins. And only because from that perspective, the NFL has just turned me sour with the money game that they play. And, that's just how I feel about it.
Yeah, I understand. All right. So you mentioned Pitt, and that's actually kind of the direction I wanted to go in because it's the biggest state university in Western Pennsylvania, and there are actually a couple of interesting connections to Navy. In any case, the guy who's been in the news lately for them has been their quarterback, Kenny Pickett, who had a fantastic year. In fact, he was a Heisman Trophy finalist and ended up, Bryce... who was it? Bryce Young, from Alabama, ended up winning.
Yeah.
But Pickett was right there in the thick of things. And I just wanted to get your take on him. Statistically, he had a great season. And not a lot of people know about it. He just kind of flew underneath the radar. So I was wondering what you could share with the audience about him.
First of all, I've been watching Kenny since he was a freshman because he came in as a freshman and got some playing time pretty early on in his career. Keep in mind that he had a 6-year career.
Right.
He got that extra year because of COVID. He actually went to, I forget if it was the Manning camp or something Manning's had sponsored. I believe it was Peyton. And Peyton said, you really should seriously consider going back to school for an extra year and making a name and just taking all that knowledge you've gained and taking advantage of it. And he did. Man, he's a natural leader. I'll tell you what, he's just fun to watch. He's got all those intangibles you want. He had the respect of that team. He would do whatever it would take on the field to get them to win. I mean, you think about their bowl game alone, it was the championship game when he took off up the field, faked a slide, ran it the rest of the way. He made them change a rule, basically, because of his fake slide. I mean, the man would do whatever it would take to win. And I always loved that about him. The big thing about him recently had been, they talked about his hand size. I listened to various, I listen to a lot of different guys come on the radio. And one guy said, we've been doing this for 30 years and he has the smallest hands ever. He has 8.5s. You know what? Hands and heart don't even equate together.
Yeah.
If you can get it done, you can get it done. Now, I recognize that the NFL football is slightly bigger than the college football, but the guy wears a glove on his hand. I'm sure that helps. I'm sure he recognizes that. And I'm sure he's going to do whatever it takes to make himself successful. Again, when Drew Brees came out, they talked about his size. He's little. He's not going to make it. Let's talk about Drew Brees' career. Yeah. I mean...
Yeah, and then you look at somebody like, Patrick Mahomes now and our guy here in Arizona, Kyler Murray.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I totally agree with you there.
I had a problem with them, like, nitpicking at him.
Yep.
They do say, though, that, and if you listen to the analysts, they say that he is not a franchise-ready quarterback. Well, depending on who takes him, he may not need to be the franchise-ready quarterback next year.
Right.
He might need a couple of years to get seasoning at that next level. But I think when you inevitably plug him into play with that seasoned understanding of the NFL, he is going to be a franchise quarterback for a long time.
Right. Yeah, and talking about that in terms of what team he may go to, right now, and again, I'm not a big mock draft guy at all. And Mel Kiper Jr., I got to take him in small doses, but he's got him going at number 11 to the Washington Commanders. And I don't know, you're there in Frederick, so I don't know how much noise you hear out of DC, from down south. I was wondering if you've caught any kind of talk coming out of those sports talk shows and what they might say about him.
Well, let's start here. That's not going to happen because they just traded and got Wentz in, and they're paying Wentz $28 million. They actually just cut two guys today to get $17 million under the cap because they were snug up against it. They haven't made one move yet in free agency. So that's not going to happen for them. I think they're going to look at addressing more like the positions that they ended up cutting today. That just, it only makes sense to me right now. They're all over the board.
Yeah.
Their number one cut should be their owner.
Yeah.
Like he tries to pull the Jerry Jones stuff and he's not that football knowledgeable.
Right.
He still has a dark cloud hanging over his head about the thing that happened with the cheerleaders that they swept under the rug, the thing that was going on with John Gruden that got Gruden fired, and he was the only one that they actually called out on that. Like, there's a lot of dark cloud hanging over top of Snyder, and I have no idea why the league has not come down on him. I know a few years back, if you remember this, the NBA, the one owner had done something. I can't remember if it was a racial comment. Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but they forced him to sell.
Right.
If you remember correctly.
Yeah. That was Donald Sterling. He used to own the LA Clippers.
We got a multi-billion-dollar organization here, the National Football League, and I don't understand why they are just sitting on their hands when it comes to Dan Snyder.
Yeah.
No clue.
That's a head scratcher. All right, so kind of continuing along the subject of Pitt. Actually, the idea came to me after we spoke on your show, and I thought, hey, it'd be kind of cool to look up a lot of different connections between Pitt and Navy and maybe talk about those. So the most obvious one to me, and there's actually two of them that I want to focus on, basketball and football. Okay, so we can start with basketball first because that was the one that jumped out at me right away. We spoke about the fact that when I was a freshman at the academy, that's when Paul Evans took over as coach of the midshipmen.
Yeah.
And he came from a little D3 school in upstate New York and had a reputation for playing a style where you really focused on the front line. And certainly when he got to Navy, he was able to recruit two of the best that have ever suited up for the mids, and that was Vernon Butler and David Robinson. So he was there for basically 6 years. And during that time, his record was 119 wins and 61 losses. There was actually a 3-year stretch between 1984 and 1986 where the mids were 80 and 19. Evans took them to the NCAA tournament twice, including that unbelievable year in 1986 when they got all the way to the Elite Eight. That team led by Robinson and Butler was the best that Navy's ever put on the floor. And to be quite honest, I just don't see a Service Academy team making it to the Elite Eight anymore.
It's tough.
Yeah. So anyway, of course, then he goes to Pitt, and I didn't know, obviously you followed Pitt back then, but I didn't know how much you were dialed into that program when he showed up. If you can kind of recall the atmosphere back when he came, what were the circumstances? Did the coach before him, was he let go? Did he just decide to move on to another team? Or what do you recall from that time?
I actually don't remember who the coach was before that,
Mm-hmm.
but I know when they brought in Evans, they talked him up as a player's coach, which was a big part of the reason that they felt he had so much success with Navy, bringing in those high, you got high character guys to come in there. And with high character guys means that they're buying into what the coach is selling, because I'm sure they had other opportunities. And I know they really sold that to the Pitt program. The program that he had there, though, and it really had the city excited about basketball. Like they talked a lot about potentially getting an NBA team back then and things like that. I mean, it's always kicked around here and there, but Pittsburgh's not a basketball city per se from that perspective. But I can tell you back then, let me just drop some names for you. Okay. These are the guys that he had on this squad that was probably, if not the best, one of the top three. Charles Smith, Jerome Lane, Curtis Aiken, Demetrius Gore, even like Rod Brookin and Pat Cavanaugh, who I think I told you earlier, that was like one of his last guys coming off the bench, but he was a highly productive guy on this team. Like they bought into the mission that Evans brought there, and they were good. Like it was kind of sad that they lost like they did in those guys' senior year in the Big Dance. I mean, the Big East was legit back then too.
Oh, definitely.
Like to win the Big East, it was legit.
Yeah, I mean, it was my favorite conference to watch back then because of you had Pitt, you had Georgetown, Syracuse, St. John's. All those big teams going at it head to head, and I mean, a lot of people could make a case that teams that come out of the Big East, get so beat up during the tournament, they end up going into the NCAA tournament, and they're just, the legs might not be as fresh, that sort of thing. But you're right, that '88 team was strong. I think they still ended up finishing the year ranked 8th. But they were a number 2 seed going into that tournament and ended up bowing out on basically what was a miracle shot against Vanderbilt. So it was just one of those things that, it happens. And unfortunately, they were on the other end of it that particular time. So
unfortunately, that's one of the greatest things about the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a powerhouse. Just make the dance and get a couple breaks.
Yeah. I mean, look at the Loyola Chicago did a few years back. I mean, they made it all the way to the Final Four, and that's a little tiny private school. So
yeah.
Yeah. So, all right, let's move on to football. That was the one where there's a connection that's a little bit more strong. And before Navy moved over to the American Conference, they used to play Pitt on a fairly regular basis. I know they played 3 times in the 2000s and a couple of times just within the last 10 years. But also back in the 70s and 80s, that's when you saw a lot of matchups. And I know I can't remember what year Marino graduated. This might have been the year after he graduated, but I think Pitt played Navy in '82 and beat the Mids, and that was a home game because I remember seeing that one. And then in the 2000s, Pitt won twice and Navy won once. And the two that Pitt won was when they had Shady McCoy. they had no
Makes
answer
sense.
for him. He just ran all over the place. And then the Mids have won the last 2. I think Pitt leads the overall series 22-15, and the Mids have won the last couple. One was in a bowl game back in 2015, and then the other one was when they squared off in 2013. That was Keenan Reynolds' sophomore year, and it was actually Aaron Donald's senior year. And they were both 2 fairly evenly matched teams at that point. And I think Navy ended up winning on a last-second field goal, 24-21. But I remember Donald because he had a pretty awesome game. I mean, because of the offense that Navy runs, I mean, he had a reputation as really going after the passer, and they just didn't throw a lot of passes. But so overall, he had like 4 tackles, but I think one of them was for a loss, and it was when he went after Keenan Reynolds on an option run and basically almost took him out of his cleats on the hit. I mean, this was before Reynolds figured out that knack for kind of slipping tackles and stuff like that. But his first year, I was literally scared for him because I just saw him get popped a couple of times and just wondered if he's going to get up again. But that was the kind of hit that Donald laid on him. But he bounced back up and they were able to win the game. But what I wanted to do was just kind of get your take on Aaron Donald when he was in college and just how much people thought about him and if they figured that was going to transition to the pros to the extent that it did.
Well, let's start with when he was in high school. He went to Penn Hills High School, which was always a powerhouse high school back in Western Pennsylvania in the WPIAL, Western Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic League, which is one of the, usually if you win the WPIAL, it's like winning a state championship in Western PA. I'll be quite honest with you. You are a powerhouse. And if I could just start dropping names of guys who have come through the WPIL that are playing in the league now, that played in the league before, or that are in the Hall of Fame. But, he came out of Penn Hills. And one of the things that keeps people attractive to guys from the WPIL is when they stay home and go to Pitt, even Penn State. They love that. And that was one thing he did. So I'm sure he definitely had everybody on board with him back then, as he did when he got to the league. I don't know if anybody ever expected him to be the guy he is in the league, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's such a coin flip. We have the draft coming up at the end of April, and all these guys are rated 1 through whatever 1,000, and only so many guys get picked. And how many guys go in the top 10 and never even make it?
Yeah.
They just, they bow out. So, Aaron Donald was driven, and he made a name for himself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm sure there were a lot of people who said, I think he can make it, but I don't know if anybody ever thought that he would be the guy he is.
Yeah.
I mean, looking forward, and I know you were going to talk about this, but, the 2 plays he made at the end of that Super Bowl, those are difference makers. Those are made by guys that are legends.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he inevitably made himself a legend by doing that, because he really was, like, let's face it, if you watch the Super Bowl, he was not the dominant guy. They were double and triple teaming him, making sure they chip him.
Mm-hmm.
They were running the ball away from him. If they ran the ball at him, it was in some sort of misdirection. So they game planned well for him.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I think no matter what, this guy was cut out to be who he is today.
Right.
He took it and he ran with it.
Right. And so just to kind of touch on, what he did do in college, he ranks, on the team anyway, he ranked 4th all time in sacks, and he's got 29.5. And what I think was really interesting was when you look at his total number of tackles, 181 on his career, 66 of them were for a loss. So we're talking 1 in 3 times he's going after the ball carrier, he's taking him down behind the line of scrimmage. So that's pretty impressive. But yeah, I'm with you. I knew he was good when he came out of college. I just didn't know he was going to be that good. And you mentioned those last couple of plays. I think, on the one where he kept the guy from getting the first down, to me, that was probably an even better play than the one he made to get around the 2 guys to sack not to basically, keep Burrow from making that completion, because he had a hold of the guy and he had the presence of mind to fall backward. Most of the time you get a hold of a dude, you just drive him to the ground, and sometimes the forward motion is what gets him the first down, right? But he didn't do that. He basically grabbed him and just pulled him back like a wrestler, trying to take him down. And the guy's helmet got to the first down marker, but not the ball, because that was tucked into his waist. So I think that was just an incredible play from just a football IQ standpoint. And then, of course, he just used his superior athletic skill and strength to get around a double team to get to Burrow and make him rush that pass. So
I was honestly astounded that they looked at that for as long as they did, because it was very clear cut. That was not a first down. Hey, I'll tell you how well Aaron Donald is still loved in Pittsburgh, even though he plays for the Rams. On March 4th this year, they had Aaron Donald Day.
How about that? Yeah,
in the
that's
city
pretty
of Pittsburgh.
cool.
Yep.
All right. So here's what I want to do next in talking about, Navy and Pitt football. I was actually just kind of cruising around the net and just found some comparisons on the 2 programs. So what I found here is 12 specific categories where they compare the Navy football program to Pitt. And what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm going to give you the category, and you just tell me who's got the edge. Is it either Pitt or Navy? And just for the sake of for the audience, I will tell you straight up, guys, that Pitt's going to lead in most of these. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm going to be seeing if Mark can pick out the couple or so that Navy has the edge in as we go through. But I'm going to go through all 12 of them, okay? All right, the first one is all-time record in terms of wins and losses. Navy or Pitt? Pitt, yeah. But that one's closer than you might think. There's only 20 wins that separate them. The Panthers have 749 wins against 547 losses and 42 ties, while the Midshipmen have 729 wins against 586 losses and 57 ties. So a slight edge to the Panthers there in terms of the winning percentage. Okay, so that's not too bad. I was a little bit surprised to see that. Next one, national championships.
Pitt.
Yep. They've got I think a total of 9 altogether, and believe it or not, that ranks 5th all time out of the 131 programs right now. So
wow, I did not know that.
Now I guess it's been a while since they got one, but it's been even longer since Navy's got their one. That was back like in the 1920s or something like that. So
I can tell you that Pitt has some other programs that are on the rise there. Their volleyball program, their baseball program.
Yeah.
Those programs are on the rise.
Yeah. And I do recall our women's soccer team played Pitt last year, and the Panthers won that one. So, okay, conference championships.
I'm going to say Navy on that one.
Okay, so that one's actually Pitt. And the biggest reason is because unless you count independence as a conference, which I really don't, there's been a couple of times where Navy's finished atop the list of independents. Not terribly often, but Pitt's got a total of 3 conference championships, and Navy doesn't have any by the way they measure now, but they did make it to that championship game in the American Conference back in 2016.
Interesting.
Okay, let's see what's next. Oh, number of bowl games.
Pitt.
Yep. Pitt's got the edge there. They have been to 36 bowl games, which is good for a ranking of 26 out of the 131 programs. Meanwhile, the Mids have been to 24, and that puts them in 49th place. Number of all-time wins. I mentioned the record before, but number of all-time wins. That was, I think I gave that one away.
Yeah, you did. It was Pitt.
That's right. Yeah, Pitt's got an edge by about 20 wins there. Okay, bowl record.
I'm going to throw that one at Navy again.
Okay, all right. You're right about that one. Navy's got a record of 12, 11, and 1, and Pitt is just slightly under 500 there. In fact, let's see. Yeah, I already mentioned that bowl game that Navy played Pitt in back in 2015. That was the year that Keenan Reynolds was a senior. Navy won 11 games that year, and Reynolds set the record for most number of rushing touchdowns by a quarterback in that bowl game.
Yeah, he was pretty dynamic.
Yeah. Okay, next one is number of All-Americans.
Pitt.
Yep, no doubt. The Panthers have 54 consensus All-Americans, which places them 8th nationally. And the Midshipmen have 24, which is pretty good. And that puts them at 31. Heisman Trophy winners.
Pitt.
That was Navy, actually.
Oh, wow. So Staubach?
Yeah, Staubach and Bellino from Navy, and Tony Dorsett was the only one from Pitt.
That's it? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize. Well, okay.
Yeah. And
I was thinking maybe back a long, long time ago.
Right. Okay. Oh, here's a good one. Number of NFL draft picks.
I'll probably go with Pitt on that one.
Yeah, for sure. The Panthers have had 289 players drafted into the NFL, while the Mids have only had 18. And then it gets even funnier. First round draft picks.
I'd definitely go with Pitt on that one.
Right. The Panthers lead in that category 25-0. And then the last couple weeks in the AP poll, in other words, the top 25.
Pitt?
Yep. Pitt has been ranked in the top 25 for a total of 308 weeks, which is good for a ranking of 27th in the country. Meanwhile, the Mids have achieved that top 25 ranking for a total of 139 weeks, and that's good for a ranking of 63. And then finally, we have the number of weeks at number 1.
Oh, I'll probably have to ride Pitt on that.
Yeah, for sure. Navy's never been at number 1 at any time, not since they've had the AP poll anyway. So yeah, that's it. Out of the 12, Pitt came on top in 10 of them. So the only 2 categories where Navy had the edge was in the number of Heisman Trophy winners, and they led in that category 2-1, and also the bowl game record. Right now, the Mids are 12, 11, and 1, while the Panthers sit at 14 and 22.
Navy's made more bowls in the recent, like say 25 years than Pitt has actually made, so that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, you're right about that one. Okay, cool. All right, so that takes care of that. I tell you what we'll do. We'll step away for a quick break, and when we return, we'll continue our conversation with Mark Maraday. All right, welcome back to Navy Sports Central. Carl Darden here with you, and my guest today is Mark Maraday, who is the host of the Original Sports Podcast. So here's what we're going to do next, Mark. We're just going to do like a little rapid fire thing here to kind of finish things up.
Okay.
You mentioned you were a teacher.
Yes.
So tell me your favorite subject that you teach.
Probably my first aid class. I certify kids in CPR, AED, and basic first aid skills. Mm-hmm. I have an American Red Cross program. I was asked to to get trained in like 12 years ago or something like that. And I got the training, and I've been doing it over 1,000 people, probably like 1,200 people now that I've certified.
Wow. Okay. That's a big number. Now, just give me your funniest student story. It can relate to anything, but whether it's in class, on a project, whatever.
Okay. So in a nutshell, I'm going to give you a story about a kid who was getting ready to graduate and go to the Marines. Mm-hmm. And this is back when vaping was just kind of coming onto the radar.
Okay.
And we're sitting in a classroom one day. It's the end of the day. And I'm over at my computer doing something, and they're in their desks and they're working on something. And I look up and I see this giant cloud of smoke as if it was a train whistle that just blew in my classroom, And I'm like, oh my God, did I really just see that? And I walk over to the kid and I said, what was that? And he said, oh, I just hit my vape. And I'm like, are you serious, man? You're in the middle of my classroom. We're in the middle of class. Do you think that's okay to do? And he's like, oh, we're cool. We're cool, Meredith. We're cool. I'm like, oh, we're cool. Yeah, but you can't do that. So I dropped it at that. I went, saw administration. Kid got suspended for a day. And this is like 2 weeks before he's graduating. Mm-hmm. Comes back, comes in my class. He says, can I talk to you? I said, yeah, you could talk to me, of course. So he comes over and he says, why'd you turn me in and get me suspended? I said, are you kidding me? Or are you serious? If I let this slide by just because we're cool, the way you want to say it, what am I telling the rest of the class?
Right.
What am I saying to everybody else? So he's like, oh, okay, whatever. Mm-hmm. So the kid graduates, and about a year later, he comes back to visit me after he gets out of Marine boot camp. Mm-hmm. And he says, man, I just want to apologize to you. I thought about that a lot for a long time. And what I did to you, what I did that day was just me being stupid. Mm-hmm. So it's not a funny story, but it was just insane to see that happen in front of my face in the classroom. I was like, wow, I can't believe that's so ballsy. To be honest with you, I was like, wow, that's unreal.
Well, I'm always curious when you hear stories like that, for kids that do end up going into the military, and especially the Marine Corps. I would have liked to have been a fly on the wall within the first hour or two that they got sworn in, and just that immediate culture shock that they would get when, the DI is in their face and everything like that. So pretty wild. Okay, so Mark, we're going to finish up with a question that I actually stole from you because I thought it was such a great question from when we spoke. And Mark asked me, who would I put on my Mount Rushmore of Navy sports? So I don't think I've ever shared my answer with the listeners before. So unless they actually heard the program, they wouldn't know. But so the way I decided to do it was I went with, the first two were basically no-brainers. I went with Roger Staubach and David Robinson. And the main reason is because they excelled at every level, both college and pro. They both won world championships, and they're both in the Hall of Fame. So I don't think there's any denying that. The other thing I wanted to do was go with a representative from the women's sports, because when I got there, the women's sports were just starting to kind of take off. Women were admitted in 1976. So by the time I got there in 1980, you had a lot of them that are just starting to kind of transition to from D2 to D1 programs. Some of them even started out as club programs before they jumped to varsity, that sort of thing. So the woman I wanted to put on there is a member of the basketball team. She was a class of 82. Her name is Colleen Cassidy. And I will tell you that my source for this is my classmate Becky Lewis, who was a captain of the team when we were seniors, and she played with Colleen for a couple of years. And then Becky came back to actually be an assistant coach on the team, and she's still dialed into the program. So she knows, she's basically seen a whole generation of players pass through the academy and knows, the kind of talent that has been that basically has walked on the court. And to this day, 40 some odd years, exactly 40 years later, Colleen Cassidy still leads. She still holds the record for most average points per game after 40 years. So pretty incredible, I think. And then she's still near the top in total points scored. So, and back in the day, they didn't have a 3-point line when she finished up, and she could hit from just about any range as well. So that's who I put up there. And then the last representative I actually selected was an entire team, and that would be the heavyweight rowing team from 1952, because they won the NCAA championship that year, actually 3 years in a row, I believe. And then they also won the gold medal at the Helsinki Olympics in 1952. And the most amazing thing there was the year before, in 1951, they competed in NCAAs, and none of their 3 boats finished because they all sank due to a storm the previous day had really kind of churned up the Ohio River. That's where they had the championships that year. And they were having to dodge all kinds of debris in the river and just were not that successful. So they went from basically not having any boats finish at all to national champions and then Olympic champions in the same year. So pretty impressive turnaround there. And the last thing that I'll mention is that this crew, which was also known as a Great Eight, won 29 consecutive races, and no other program has come close to doing that. Okay, so Mark, that I've set the table for what I have for Navy's Mount Rushmore. So you can choose one sport, any sport, or you can choose a number of sports. It doesn't matter. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you give me your 4.
I'm going to add an extra head to my Mount Rushmore, okay?
Okay, so we'll go with 5.
That's what I'm going to do. All right, so I started out with Tony Dorsett. I mean, his name speaks for himself. He won Super Bowls with the Cowboys. He won a national championship, the last national championship Pitt won. He was the centerpiece. He was the marquee player on that team. And, even though he was a Dallas Cowboy during the Steelers' heyday, he was still beloved in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And he still is today.
Yep.
Next is Dan Marino.
Okay.
I mean, again, another guy whose name speaks for himself. There was always speculation that he should have been a Steeler, but there was something about Dan Marino that kept Chuck Noll from wanting to draft him. Uh-huh. And at the end of the day, I think that the Rooneys were kind of buffaloed by that whole thing. Otherwise, the Steelers' fortunes during the 80s and 90s might have been a little different early on. Mm-hmm. Then I went in another direction, and I grabbed Roger Kingdom.
Right.
Roger
He's
Kingdom was
a sprinter, right?
Yeah, he was a sprinter, a hurdler. Uh-huh. Ran for Pitt, was in the Olympics. He's a 2-time Olympian. Mm-hmm. I had a kid from my high school actually go to Pitt on a track scholarship and challenge his records there. He was that good.
Wow.
But kids are so much faster than Kingdom was back then. Now, yeah. So, then I chose Charles Smith from the basketball program. Yep. I think it speaks for itself when we talked about Paul Evans and the team he had, 86, 87. Those guys were unbelievable, but Smith was the leader. He was the centerpiece on that team. He had a nice NBA career, and, really, I don't think they ever really replaced a big man like Smith. I mean, they've had some guys come through, but nobody like Smith was for them. Mm-hmm. And finally, Susie McConnell-Serio, who was a basketball player for the University of Pittsburgh. She was a stud. Mm-hmm. I believe she was on the Olympic team too. I'm almost 100% sure. And she actually coached at Duquesne, and now she's at Pitt.
Oh, how about coaching. That? Yeah. All right. So is she the head coach at Pitt or one of the assistants, or?
I'm almost 100% sure she is the head coach now.
That's awesome. Yeah. Always good when you have a player who is successful at the program come back and coach, I think, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. All right. I guess, Mark, this is going to do it for our conversation. Listen, I had a great time talking. It's always great to talk sports. I mean, like I said, I mostly focus on Navy stuff, but it's always kind of good to kind of branch out a little bit. So I appreciate you being on the show with me. And thanks for sharing your perspective on the Pitt Panthers. I'm hopeful that on some level, I know it may not happen in football that quickly, but I'll be keeping an eye out when they can kind of go head to head in other sports, and maybe we can chat again. And finally, I did want to give you a chance to let everybody know where they can find you and your show, the Original Sports Podcast with Mark Maraday.
Absolutely. I appreciate you having me on as a guest. And people need to listen to you on my episode. They can check me out at Original Sports Podcast with Mark Maraday. I'm on any place you can download a podcast, listen to a podcast, or you can go right to my website, originalsportspodcast.com, and find it there, because we had a great conversation too.
Yeah, guys, I tell you, and I was kind of looking at my information. I do have at least one person from Pittsburgh who's heard this show a couple of times, but so far I've been able to figure out that this reach has got like about I don't know, about maybe 400 cities or across the country. So I'm sure, Mark, you've been doing this a little bit longer than I have, and just the scope of what you discuss is pretty cool too. So guys, if you're listening to this show, especially if you're in the Pittsburgh area, but you don't have to be, go ahead and tune in the Original Sports Podcast with Mark Maraday. It's a lot of fun to listen to. So thanks a lot, Mark. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you having me.
All right. Take care now. Okay. We're going to take a quick breather and be right back with our question of the day. All right. Thanks for staying with us, everyone. It is time for our question of the day. And like we always do, let's start with checking the responses on the question from our last episode. That was the one that came to me kind of on the spur of the moment as I was going over how people had responded to the poll question about the short circumference of the rugby ball. I was curious to know who makes up our Facebook group. As you may or may not know, we have about 700 members, and I typically figure on about maybe 10% engagement, and that just means either liking or commenting on different content that's on the page. And I was happy to note that on this particular poll question, we actually had a 15% response. So that was pretty cool. And just to refresh your memory, here was the question. Among all of us who've joined the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page, which bucket do you fall into? The first one was, I went to the academy. Next was, I am the parent of a current mid or a recent graduate. After that was, I have a relative or a close friend that graduated from Annapolis. And then finally, I just happen to be a big Navy sports fan. So as of the time of this recording, we had 108 responders. So that was pretty awesome. And here's how things broke out. There were 54 responders who went to the Naval Academy. 35 of you let us know that you are big Navy sports fans. And I know that does include a number of Navy veterans because I've had some conversations with you. And then also there were 15 in the group that were either parents of current midshipmen or ones who have recently graduated. And finally, 4 people got back to us to say that they had a close friend or relative that graduated from the academy. Now, there are also some great comments that some of you added as well. Fred Paon's dad was a professor at the academy, and his family actually sponsored Joe Bolino. So, how cool is that to be able to say that one of Navy's 2 Heisman Trophy winners was a regular visitor in your home? And Fred also mentioned that he saw the very first football game at Navy Marine Corps Stadium. So that's pretty awesome. Also, Tom Nicholas is a Navy vet who actually served about the same time that me and my classmates did, and his son is starting his application process this summer. And then finally, Loretta Scarborough's husband was from the class of 1966, and he actually ran varsity track. So thanks, you guys, for those great comments. There are some more interesting ones as well, so be sure to check them out on the group Facebook page when you get a chance. Now, let's get to our question from this week. We are well into the spring sports season, and I want to know which Navy team or teams you think have the best shot at winning a Patriot League championship. And there's multiple choices here, so just kind of bear with me. First choice is men's lacrosse. Next is women's lacrosse. And then I'm going to go with men's and women's outdoor track, followed by men's and women's tennis. So those are going to be 6 separate choices for you guys to choose from, and you can select more than one. This question will be up on the group Facebook page by the end of the day, so you can respond there. And please, just like last time, feel free to add any comments because I will mention at least a couple on the next podcast. Thanks a lot. All right, let's keep moving along to our mid-watch segment. And today we're going to identify the 2 athletes we'll be tracking for the rest of the spring. This time we're going to focus on a couple of lacrosse players. So on the women's side, the player we'll be tracking is Reagan Roloffs. She is a senior attacker from Apple Valley, Minnesota. Right now, she has 20 goals and 8 assists to lead the women's team with 28 points. And Roloffs also has 2 game-winning goals so far this season. Her best game to date was against Bucknell. That was the Patriot League season opener last week. Roloffs had 7 points in the 15-3 win. And one thing I did want to mention is she is one of the very best in the league when it comes to controlled draws, which is basically the face-off. The main difference between the men's game and the women's game is that the women do it basically standing up with the ball, caught between the sticks at about probably chest level, whereas the men kind of do it kneeling down. So Roloffs has won 47 controlled draws so far this season, and I look at those and ground balls about the same as I do rebounds in basketball. I mean, you can't score if you don't have the ball, and those are the 2 primary ways to get it. And Roloff just has a knack for coming up with it either herself on the draw or getting it over to a teammate. The Mids are 7-2 so far and 1-0 in league play, and Roloffs will definitely be one of the keys to the team's success in order to compete for a league championship. Now, on the men's side, the player we'll be tracking is junior midfielder Pat Skalniak from Dallas, Texas. He's got 20 goals and 15 assists to lead the team with 35 points. He goes 6'3" and is a solid 200 pounds and is just an excellent playmaker. Skalniak has started every game for the Mid since he showed up in Annapolis, and he has registered at least a point in every single one. In the win over Johns Hopkins that we talked about earlier, he had a season-high 3 assists to go along with his 3 goals. Now, the Mids weren't picked to win the Patriot League this year, but you never know what can happen. I had mentioned earlier that in his first recruiting season, Navy coach Joe Amplo landed the number 1 recruiting class according to Inside Lacrosse magazine, so they clearly have a lot of talent. And with the win over Hopkins on the road, I mean, that's a pretty good indicator that they may be ready to challenge teams like Loyola over the next couple of years. And Skalniak figures to be one of the Mids leading that charge. So we'll see what happens as the men's lacrosse team gets into the meat of their Patriot League schedule. That's going to do it for this edition of Navy Sports Central. Thank you all so much for joining us. Now, if you like what you've heard, be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to spread the word to all the other Navy fans out there. Thanks again to my special guest, Mark Maraday, for joining me today and giving us his perspective on the Pittsburgh Panthers athletic program. We have been getting a great response to our question of the day, so if you want to jump in on that, just go to the Navy Sports Nation group Facebook page. I will go ahead and pin it to the top so you won't miss it. And just a quick reminder, the views expressed on Navy Sports Central are my own and do not reflect those of the U.S. Naval Academy or Navy Athletics. By the way, the music used in Navy Sports Central comes to you courtesy of Audio Jungle. This is a great site for purchasing the rights to use music from thousands of artists around the world, and those we feature in the podcast will be credited in our show notes. Talk to you soon, everybody. Until next time, this is Carl Darden. Go Navy, beat Army.